Welcome to Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast, where we talk with the nation's top experts about today's toughest parenting challenges. Whether you're concerned about your child's development, learning, behavior, or you just want to make family time more enjoyable, we share the practical solutions and tools that can help.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast. I'm your host, Stephanie Boucher, and today I'm here with serial entrepreneur, substance abuse expert, and mother Carolyn Bradfield to talk about what parents can do to prevent their children and teenagers from abusing drugs and alcohol and developing the disease of addiction. Carolyn is the co-founder of Phoenix Outdoor, a licensed wilderness therapy program that focuses on substance abuse, addiction, and intense family treatment. In December of 2017, Carolyn lost her 29-year-old daughter Laura to an overdose after a 15-year battle with addiction. As a result of her experiences, she recently started the Laura Project, which aims to help families identify children at risk for addiction and create strategies to prevent the disease. Now, just a quick reminder that if you're not currently a Torchlight user, as offered in your employer's benefit plan, but you would like to be, then you can ask your employer to call us. They can find our information on our website, which is found at torchlight.care. Again, that's www.torchlight.care. So, without further ado, let's get started. Good morning, Carolyn. Thank you so much for being here today. This is a really difficult topic for many people to discuss, but it's a conversation that society and especially parents absolutely must have and on a regular basis if we are going to make a dent in the battle with addiction and the epidemic we have going on in this country right now. So I thank you for being here with me today. You know this topic well, unfortunately. You lost your beautiful daughter, Laura, to this drug epidemic last December, to an overdose after a 15-year-long battle with addiction. And while I'm so very sorry that Laura isn't here with us, I'm also incredibly grateful to you as a mother that you are so open and willing to share your experiences with all of us so that we can help our children and start solving this terrible problem together. Just days after Laura passed, you did something really incredible and something that I think that many people would not have been able to do so quickly. You started the Laura Project, which is going to be an ongoing initiative to help educate parents about addiction and substance abuse prevention. And as part of that, you started Lessons from Laura. And it was a series of blog posts in which you posted one of the lessons that you'd learned going through this process with your daughter every day during the month of January. And I just wanted to read a passage from your opening blog post because I think it really clearly demonstrates a very common thought process in the mind of most parents. You wrote that you hear stories about drug use, the opioid crisis, and overdoses, and are likely thanking your lucky stars that your children are safe. The reality is that no one is really safe these days. As I look back, my Laura grew up very connected, was a Girl Scout, played soccer, was a good student, and had a very involved mother. I never bothered to educate myself about the darker side of the world she lived in because I didn't think it applied to us or that we would ever be touched by drugs. We know that there is an intense drug epidemic in this country, and yet most people feel somewhat insulated from it as if they will never be touched by it. Why do you think it is that most people have this false sense of security? Why has this become the norm? And what is it that parents and families really need to understand about the numbers?
Well, first of all, let me thank you for the opportunity to share some of the insights that I've had in this 15-year struggle in trying to help Laura battle through addiction. And I know it is an uncomfortable conversation because oftentimes people are very reluctant to take a look at what this might mean in their own personal life. And so I think a lot of times people don't want to look at it, talk about it, or think about it because they look at their beautiful 7 or 8 year old who is playing soccer and is that Girl Scout. And so they can't ever imagine that it would happen to them. I think their paradigm of people that are drug addicted or that person from the ghetto with a needle stuck in their arm and, coming from the wrong side of the tracks. And the reality is incredibly quite different, that addiction affects a large number of the population. So you just asked me what the statistics were, and I'll just quote you a few numbers that are a little bit startling. So today, somewhere around 27 million Americans are suffering from either drug or alcohol addiction. When I look at children, teenagers, ages 12 to 17, the statistics are that 1 in every 12 are suffering from the disease of addiction. And then I go a little bit beyond that, ages 18 to 25, it's 1 in every 6, 16.8%. Wow. So it's a huge number. And so, I would just challenge people to look around at their coworkers in their neighborhood with their friends, and there's not going to be a single person in your community of contacts that don't either know someone addicted, have a coworker that's addicted, have a family member that's addicted. There is a domino effect. So for every addict, there's 4 or 5 or more people that their lives are touched or impacted because that person is struggling with the disease. So I think it's a combination of not understanding, not believing that it applies to you, and not really being aware of just how prevalent it is.
Absolutely. You referred to something in your comments just now that sort of struck me, and that is that, when people think of someone who suffers from an addiction, they sort of have this vision in their mind of what it should look like or what it is. Let's talk a little bit about what addiction actually is. How might people's perceptions of addiction be different from the reality? What is addiction to you?
Well, let's start talking about what it is not. Most people look at addiction and they think, oh, well, this is a person that's made a series of bad choices. They are weak-willed. They have poor character, and they're just making a conscious choice to wreck their lives. And the reality is much different. Basically, what addiction is a disease. It's a disease of the mind. And because the brain is misfiring, because it's been exposed to substances generally too early in its development, that brain is responding by overproducing dopamines that motivate the person to go refeed the brain with the substances that kick off that pleasure response. So, you can look at other diseases like diabetes or cancer or Parkinson's, or just pick any other disease that is persistent and chronic. Addiction is no different than that. It is a disease that has its roots in your genetics. It has its roots in the way that your brain was developed, and that development was cut short, as it was with Laura when she began using at 14. And it creates a set of compulsive behaviors that really drive that person to go use over and over again. They find it very, very difficult to resist feeding the brain with the substances that it's looking for.
You talk a lot in your work about how imperative it is that people understand their family history in terms of substance use and abuse. Why is it that you place so much emphasis on that? How is it important?
Well, let's talk about children, because that's my particular focus is,
sure.
Taking a look at the early predictors of the risk of developing the disease, much in the same way that you would look at if you were a woman who had a history of breast cancer and you had the BRCA gene, you would know that you have a much, much elevated level of risk. So addiction does have a genetic root. And so when you look at your family history, close relatives, particularly in your immediate family, or uncles or aunts, grandparents that have been addicted, the child has a much, much greater chance of developing addiction down the road. And in fact, 80% of people that become addicted develop the disease before they're 18 years old. So certainly you would want to look at that person in a much different way, knowing that there's an elevated risk because it exists in your family, and act as if. So for example, if you knew you had a family history of juvenile diabetes and all of a sudden your 11-year-old starts to develop the thirst and the other symptoms of diabetes, you would want to watch out for that, knowing that they're much more at risk. So family history is critically important.
Yes, because there is a large genetic component to it. This is something that we are being made more and more aware of all the time, that was maybe not so well known in generations past. So what is the significance of the age of first use of a potentially addictive substance? How might the age of one who starts drinking or smoking or using drugs of some sort, what is significant about the age of first use?
Well, let's talk about when kids are actually starting to use and experiment.
Yeah.
A lot of us think that, that's that 16 or 17-year-old in high school who's feeling impulsive and he's sowing his wild oats by taking the drink from his parents' liquor bottle, etc. But the reality is, with the easy access to drugs, in fact, I live in what we call the heroin triangle in Atlanta, Georgia, in the northern suburbs. So you want drugs, pot, heroin, alcohol, whatever, it's much easier to get, and the kids are starting much younger. So oftentimes I'll see kids that are, if I've met them later in their lives, they'll say, well, I started drinking at 10 years old. So, that's a third or fourth grader.
That is every parent's worst nightmare. And I don't think any parent thinks that their 10-year-old may already have had exposure to drugs and alcohol. Yeah.
But they would be absolutely wrong. So getting back to your question, a child's brain is in a significant development path all the way up till about the age of 25, when it's generally fully developed. And there's really two sides of the brain. One is the side that is impulsive. Think about that toddler who wants it now, who throws a tantrum, etc. And the other part of your brain is the organized, rational part of the brain that makes good and appropriate decisions. Well, if you start using substances while that brain is in its development process, what happens is you short circuit the development cycle. So now that impulsive part of your brain is continuing to be the dominant part, and the organized part of your brain that should be developing has stopped developing. That's why people will often say that, the maturity level of someone that is an addict really kind of halts at the age that they start. So in my Laura's case, it was 14, 15 years old. And so when you look at her as a 21 or 22-year-old, she was really at the maturity level of where she was as a sophomore in high school. So you've got to give your brain time to go through the development process, lay down its wiring and its tracks so it's organized and less impulsive. You short circuit that early and you've got a real problem, because the brain just is not fully formed.
Yeah. And how might we talk to our children about that? Because it's ironic in a way that the time in their life where they may have the most opportunity to use drugs and alcohol irresponsibly is the same time when it is the most dangerous and detrimental to the human brain.
Well, I think that conversations with your children should start really, really early. And you don't
how early would be appropriate?
To me, it really early, like when they're 6, 7, and 8 years old. Don't have a conversation about your brain development and your wiring and the disease of addiction, because they're not really old enough to understand it. But you can take opportunities to talk to them, start laying your tracks down. So, for example, let's say that your child has a cold and you give them medicine. You can talk to them about the healthy use of medicine, who's allowed to give it to you, what it's used for, and what it shouldn't be used for. So start those conversations early. As they progress a little older in elementary school, you're going to be watching things on TV with them where you'll see people smoking, or you'll see people drinking, or you'll see other things that's just an opportunity for a conversation to understand what they know about it, what do they think about it, and then, have the parents weigh in as to what they think so that the kids understand, that using these substances, smoking those cigarettes or drinking or some of the things that they're seeing have a negative downside consequence, which is they have the power to make you addicted, that you want it, you need it, and you crave it. As they get into high school, middle school and high school, that's where you really need to lay down the specifics of what you know about addiction, that it is a disease, that their brain is in the process of being developed. If they expose their brain to the substances while it's being developed, they run the risk of developing the disease themselves. And oh, by the way, this disease runs in families, and guess what? Our family has a number of people in it that develop the disease, so therefore you're at higher risk, so you need to pay much closer attention. So you can't start the conversation with them at 15 years old and expect it to be sustainable and relevant. You've got to start it way, way early, but just make it appropriate to the age of the kid and bring them along all the way in the appropriate or inappropriate use of medications, the appropriate or inappropriate use of alcohol, and then what the risk is that they're facing should they decide to be the cool kid and experiment with the rest of their friends.
Absolutely. I really couldn't agree with you more on the idea of opening up dialogue very early on in a child's life. And, some parents have the philosophy that they can shield their child from the topic of drug abuse, that maybe we don't want to watch any television shows or movies where it might be something that they're exposed to. However, I've always sort of seen that as a great opportunity to open up the dialogue and be able to offer your 2 cents and frame it the way that you as a parent want to have the conversation, rather than have them see it anyway later on, but have you not be there to talk about it with. So I really appreciate you bringing up that point. Something else I wanted to address. You've mentioned the impact of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, and how adverse childhood experiences may in fact contribute to impulsive behavior or unhealthy choices later on. Do you want to talk about that for us a little bit? What is an adverse childhood experience, and can they be different from child to child?
Well, when we think about the risk of addiction and we want to predict who is at higher risk, there's really 3 areas we need to look at. We've already talked about the impact of genetics. What you're referring to is adverse childhood experience, ACE experiences, where a child has experienced something that they consider negative, traumatic, etc., and they don't know how to manage through it. The third area that I hope we'll focus on before the conversation is over is the ability to self-regulate, to stay in their appropriate zone so they're not overly anxious or they can make better decisions. But let's focus on adverse experiences. So there are some very obvious adverse experiences that we can all look at and say, wow, that's just obvious. Kids that are physically abused, kids that are sexually abused, kids that experience violence in the home. Those experiences create trauma for the child. And oftentimes, in order to manage their trauma and to manage all the associated feelings that go with it, they'll turn to substances. So it just absolutely multiplies the risk that they're going to use because they see that as a way out of their pain. But there are also other experiences that a child will consider adverse that a parent may not recognize. Those things were certainly true in my daughter's life. The year before she started using, she changed schools, meaning that she went to high school where she had been in middle school. Big difference in going to a school of 2,600 kids when you had been in one with under 1,000. She changed sports. She was a standout soccer player. She decided that she wanted to row, to join crew. So that changed her friend base. It changed, kind of a little bit of her identity. I sold a company, which in and of itself shouldn't seem adverse, but it required me in the new company to travel. And so She had a mother that never traveled. Now she had one that traveled a lot, and I remarried and we moved. So so she had all of those things hit her at one time. If you take some of these things and you say, all right, how is your child managing through change? They have an experience that you and I might think is normal. They consider it as adverse. They changed their school. Their friends changed. They're struggling academically. What was easy for them in elementary school became really hard for them in middle school. So they're not making the grades that they used to make.
And that happens a lot. That's very common, actually.
Well, not only does it happen a lot, but oftentimes learning differences that are undiagnosed in elementary school because the kid can actually overmanage himself and do the work really crop up when they get into middle school where they can't keep up with the work. So they're now starting to fall behind. So as a parent, you really need to pay attention to any change in your kid's life that changes their routine, changes their friend base, changes the known world that they've been operating in, and really start the conversations with them so that you understand how they're feeling about it. Gosh, going from middle school to high school must be a big change for you. Walk me through how you feel about that. What's different? What do you like about it? What troubles you about it? So you can really just get a sense of how they're processing these changes or these experiences. And then you're much more aware of the level of disruption that is present in that child's life over these adverse events.
That is incredibly good advice. Let's talk a little bit about the idea you touched on briefly earlier, this concept of self-regulation in children. How would you describe self-regulation, and how can we foster resilience in our children so that they can cope with these changes that are absolutely going to be a part of their lives? What can we do to help them there?
Well, I have a very good friend who I've worked with over a number of years. Her name is Dr. Sandy Nuez in Asheville, North Carolina, who is one of the smartest adolescent and young adult psychologists that I know. And she's studied self-regulation for years and years. And a simple explanation of regulation in a child is that the brain really has kind of two big components. It's got the frontal lobe that takes in information and it processes it, and then it sends a signal down to the stem, and the stem tells your body what to do. So that's a fight or flight response. So you're in presence of danger. The frontal lobe says, ooh, that's danger. It sends a signal to the stem of your brain that says run, hide, fight, whatever that response is. Now, in a healthy person, stimulus comes in. Let's say that somebody comes to the door and rings the doorbell. Brain processes it. It says, oh, that's a doorbell. It doesn't send that signal down to the rest of the body that says go into fight or flight mode. In a person that's not regulated, the doorbell goes off and they say, oh, that's a tiger coming to eat me. It sends a signal down to the body freezes, it runs, it does whatever it's going to do. That's lack of regulation, where the brain is giving off the wrong information to the body, and the body's either going into that fight or flight mode. So when a kid doesn't regulate themselves, they look at the things that are in their environment much more as a threat than the normal person would look. And they're generally going to have two responses to it. That kid will ball up and go into a corner because he sees it as danger. That's the flight response. Or you'll get the kid that's overly aggressive and he'll read that as a danger signal and he'll go into fight mode and pop out at you. Laura was a perfect example of someone that was not regulated. She saw everything as a threat. And because she saw everything as a threat, she overreacted. She fought about everything. She felt like she had to posture as this, big bad person that was ready to fight, and she just could not stay regulated. Plus, it kicked off a high level of anxiety for her. So she was always anxious. What's coming next at me? What's that threat coming at me? And so when you're always in that state, it's like looking through broken glass. When you attempt to make even the simplest decision, it becomes very, very difficult to do it. So from a parent's perspective, they need to look at their kid to see, gosh, are they the shrinking violet that sees something as a threat and they shrink from it, or are they overly aggressive? And what's going on? What's their brain telling them to do? And what we really want to do is you want to get the kids to function in what I'm going to call the zone, meaning that that's their stable zone. They're not on one end or the other, so they can get themselves back into a healthy place, and not look at things as the threat that they might inappropriately see from that inability to self-regulate. Well, let's equate that to substance use. Okay, so when you've got that inability to self-regulate, what you're going to do, and what Laura certainly did, is they're going to turn to drugs more often than you think to try and regulate themselves. So think about that. That's that self-medication strategy. I'm really anxious. I'm really frightened. Let me go, shoot up with heroin, and that evens me up. So that's what that inability to self-regulate does for you. Is the kid is going to try, as they get older, they'll try and find a different strategy to regulate. And this, unfortunately, is one that's easily available to them.
Yeah, it's a coping mechanism in a lot of cases. I think it's important to note here, you mentioned that your daughter had struggled with anxiety, and it's important to note, I think, that many children have coexisting issues that maybe make them more inclined to make impulsive choices or to seek out coping mechanisms such as drug use. It could be anything from ADHD to anxiety to learning disabilities, either diagnosed or undiagnosed, that have caused them some struggle that may have impacted their self-esteem over the years, and just sort of create an environment for them mentally and emotionally that could make drug use and substance abuse more likely. So I think that's worth noting to parents, is that if you notice any of these types of issues in your child, or if they have had any of these things diagnosed in the past, that's something to be aware of as you discuss drugs, and maybe even discuss that with them. Maybe even discuss how, having ADHD or some diagnosed condition may make them more prone, much the way genetics do, to become addicted more easily. Would you agree with that?
Well, I do agree with that. And I also believe that parents don't often recognize anxiety in their children. And so, when you've got a child that has a hard time fitting in, has a hard time making friends, is focused on their appearance, that's a person that's saying, hey, I don't think I'm good enough. And their anxiety really surfaces because they want to fit in socially and in every other way that's important to children. And so that's the kid that's anxious, or they're overly anxious about their performance in school. They're hyper focused on being that overachiever. So they get straight A's, you give them an A- and it sends them over the edge. So anxiety really does come from a point of view from the children that I don't feel good enough, like nothing's good enough. And so parents just need to watch out for that. Is your child fitting in? Are they being bullied, which creates a huge amount of anxiety? Are they struggling academically? And just really wire in on how much anxiety are they really experiencing. The other side of that coexisting disorder is, are they depressed? A lot of people think that depression only applies to grown-ups. That's really not true. It definitely applies to children. Depression is also another brain disorder where the brain is chemically wiring incorrectly. So you really have to look at that child that's withdrawn. They're avoiding reality. They're, not happy kids, and recognize that that's also a trigger point for a child that, as they get a little older, are going to want to turn to an easy fix to make them feel better, either reduce the anxiety or manage the depressive state that they're in.
Absolutely. Let's talk about a parent's relationship with drugs and alcohol. Obviously we live in a culture where alcohol use is very prevalent. It's in most cases, a very moderate part of someone's life, and whether it's having a glass of wine, with a meal or a beer on a cold day. For some parents, it's more than that. But how does the parent's relationship with drugs and alcohol play into a child's perception of drug and alcohol use?
Well, parents are a child's biggest role model. And so, how you act, what you do, they're watching you all the time. So it's perfectly fine to go have a glass of wine with your friends or have your friends over. But when you send the signal that I need that drink or I need that glass of wine because I am so stressed, work was awful for me today, what signal do you think you're sending your child? It's
right.
like, oh, okay, wow, this is a really good way to reduce stress. I'm really anxious, so I'm going to go do that. And my mom uses that to relieve stress. Maybe that's okay for me to do it. I am adamantly opposed to parents believing that it is okay to smoke pot, use drugs, whatever, in the presence of their child or even having it in their home. Because basically what you're doing is you're sending to the child the signal that, hey, these things that are against the law are perfectly okay because I'm doing it, so right. I'm above the law. Maybe you can be as well. So I think you have to be just very, very careful about a healthy use of alcohol, doing it for the right reasons and not for the wrong reasons, and having discussions with your children about it. And, one thing I said specifically in one of my articles is that you go and child-proof your house when you've got a toddler by putting child safety locks on the cabinets and making sure that the outlets are covered. Do the same thing with alcohol, lock it up, and also do the same thing with any medications that you may have been prescribed, not just for you, but maybe for your pet, because Laura got into the pet medications. Never even occurred to me. So don't make
it wouldn't to most people. That's a very interesting point.
Right.
Yeah.
Dogs take anxiety medication for thunderstorms. So lock that stuff up. Oftentimes I'll talk to people and their first relationship with substances is because they went and got the liquor out of the parents' liquor cabinet and then watered it down, when they drank it a little bit. Just lock it up. It's really easy to do, and don't make it available to the kids in your home. And then, you short circuit their experimentation at that young of an age.
So those are great tips for how to make your home a safer place for your children. Let's talk a little bit about how to manage and monitor your child as they're going through their formative years to make sure that you are keeping them safe. What should parents do?
Well, I think first and foremost, we live in an electronic and digital age. So the first thing I would suggest is really having a good strategy to manage and monitor their electronics, because that's the way they connect with people, their friends. That's where they get their information about the world. And that's also where they get their drugs. So if I had to go back and do it again relative to my daughter, now she would have been 30. So this was 15 years ago. People didn't have as much access to the internet, but they certainly had cell phones. So from a parent's perspective, I would monitor their social media accounts. I would have parental controls as much as I could on the internet. I would take their electronics away at night at a certain hour so they're not connecting with others, friends, etc. I would certainly monitor their search history on their computers. There's also technology that you can monitor where if they're texting, you can get the same text that they're sending so you can shadow what they're saying. So certainly you should do that at minimum. You should also be aware that a lot of kids sneak out at night. So it's not difficult to go get an alarm system, perhaps like a Simply Safe, where anytime they would open a window or open a door, a chime goes off so that you're very aware of their comings and goings. Laura snuck out at night. We didn't know that in enough time. We alarmed the house, but it was, she had already gotten a pattern of sneaking out. So you have to secure your house, secure your electronics, and you secure your child. Another strategy that I advocated in one of my articles that is a bit controversial, but I think it's one of the smartest things that one of my friends shared with me with his son is that he has a very high risk genetically in his family. Of the 5 siblings that are in his family, 3 are addicts, his brothers and sisters. So when his son got into the 8th grade, he told his son that he was going to give him a gift. And that gift was to take a very difficult decision and risk off the table for him by proactively drug testing him on a regular basis, even though he exhibited none of that behavior, none of the signs that he was using drugs. And the goal was, hey, I'm going to let you continue to be the cool kid. When your friends want you to go smoke pot or use drugs, just say, hey, look, love to do it, but my dad is all in my business and he's such a pain and he tests me all the time. I'd get caught. I just can't. And he's done that all the way through high school. So I think that parents ought to consider that strategy. You know, it's not a matter of I don't trust you. It's a matter of I'm here to protect you. And so proactively drug test them. Or if you suspect something's going on, certainly drug test them. It's cheap and easy. And at least you'll have clarity on what might be going on in their lives because you have the test to prove that.
I like the suggestion you just made about, in moments of peer pressure, instructing the child to blame it on your parents. I've always, something I've actually already told my kids is, hey, anytime you find yourself in an uncomfortable situation, blame it on me. You can totally throw me under the bus. That's fine. Whatever you need to say to get your point across that you can't participate in this.
Yeah, but just imagine though, now that's backed up with the fact that mom and dad are drug testing you. So if you're even tempted to do it, now you know that it's going to show up. So
yes, and it really gives the child an extra out too. There's not much arguing that can be done with someone after that statement is made.
Well, so, remember, you're buying them time. So I shared with you that most addicts develop the disease before they're 18 years old. Imagine if you could get them through 18 before they go to college and they didn't use. You just bought the brain a little more time to lay its tracks down before it gets exposed to the substances that could alter it.
Absolutely. Great suggestions. So on January 30th, you posted the final entry of Lessons from Laura, although the Laura project itself is just beginning. But in the last entry of your 30-day tribute to your daughter, which incidentally came just a day before what would have been her 30th birthday, you wrote the following statement. You said, "As bad as my grief is, there also comes hope, purpose, and meaning. The last 30 days of Lessons from Laura has taught me that so many of you need information, insight, and strategies to protect your children. I've lived in a 15-year cycle of grief that I will push through and move on in order to help you." Thank you so much, Carolyn, for striving so hard to help all of us. You are my new hero, and I really believe that you are going to help an infinite number of people with the wisdom that you have. Thank you for being with us today. It's been a joy.
I appreciate the opportunity. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Hey, everyone. Thanks again for listening. If you'd like more information about today's topic and you have a Torchlight Child account, you can log in and explore the e-guide called Preventing Substance Abuse, where you will find more tips for helping your child develop healthy and positive decision-making skills. You may also want to check out the tools called Talking to Your Child About Drugs and Alcohol or Talking to Your Child About a Parent's Struggle with Addiction. Both provide advice about how to have these conversations with your child at every age or stage of development. We also have a webinar called Preventing Substance Abuse, which is available on demand via our webinars page. Now, if you don't have access to Torchlight Child as offered in your employer's benefit plan, but you'd like to, then you can ask your employer to call us. They can find our information on our website, which is torchlight.care. Again, that's www.torchlight.care. Take care for now, and see you next time.
Thanks for listening to Torchlight's Exceptional Parenting Podcast. Find this and other episodes on iTunes, Spreaker, and Podcast Go. If you're interested in bringing Torchlight Child or any of Torchlight's other caregiving products to your workplace, please contact info@torchlight.care. That's info@torchlight.care.